In this example, we're going to use this story of controlling the skin growth. And the book talks only a little bit about this story. And instead, the textbook in these chapters introduces the principles and uses several different examples to introduce the principles. And we're going to use one example, tell this story well, so you can understand these chapters and then future chapters. We're going to go ahead into chapter 15, 16, 17, and those chapters, this is a setup. We're going to keep talking about these examples all in through chapter 16, 17, 18. So you want to get square on this. And so this is going to be our example. It's going to be wound healing. So you get cut, and under that scab, the skin cells grow fast to heal that owie. And they're going to grow fast because they're going to be stimulated by a protein. And the protein is called a signaling factor. And that's a general term, and signaling factors are molecules that diffuse between cells they're carrying information. In a sense, they're carrying a switch, a choice. And so here's a cell, and this cell is going to be the target, and there's going to be another cell that's a source, and this source cell is going to make a signaling factor. It's going to be a molecule, and all hormones fit into this category. All hormones are signaling factors. Hormones are made by cells in the body and then released into the blood, float, and they bind to a target cell. So all hormones fit this, as do more factors. Many signaling factors are proteins. And the reason why is because proteins have a specific shape, right? We've learned about that. And that specific shape also has surface chemistry, so it could be hydrophobic, it could be charged on its surface. So we have a complex chemical surface that can bring a bring a specific message. I am bringing this message, and it can be specific, and there could be thousands of different signaling factors bringing different kinds of message. All signaling factors function by binding to a protein. This isn't the world's greatest drawing, but they bind to a protein in the target cell, and most of those proteins are in the cell membrane, and this is called a receptor. A really famous example of this story would be, this could be the hormone estrogen, found in all vertebrates, and this could be a receptor that's called the estrogen receptor. And estrogen hormone functions by binding to the receptor, and in this case, the receptor actually happens to be, the estrogen receptor happens to be inside the cell. Estrogen binds to the receptor, and the receptor communicates the signal into the cell. The receptor is the switch. When we talk about information flow and the choice of to divide or not, it's really receptor proteins that are going to be making that choice, helping make that choice, and when they bind to the signaling factor. So our signaling factor in our example is going to be platelet-derived growth factor, Pdgf, and it's a protein, and we'll learn about it. And then the receptor is going to be called Pdgf receptor, and it's going to be a certain kind of protein, so it's going to have a binding site for Pdgf, and then inside the cell it's an enzyme. So this receptor has a binding site for Pdgf, and then it also is an enzyme, and we'll see it's a certain kind of enzyme called a kinase. Pdgf is going to stimulate skin cells to divide, to go through, advance through the cell cycle divide and heal the cut. So we know that there's a low level of cell division happening in the skin, and Pdgf is going to stimulate it. It's going to increase it. And what it's going to do is it's going to bind the receptor, and then the receptor enzyme activity is going to amplify that signal into the cell. And it's going to amplify the signal, bring the signal that Pdgf is stimulating the skin cell, the target cell, to grow and divide. And that process has a general term because we're looking at a specific example, but these are very general concepts in our body and all eukaryotes. This pathway of information flow is called signal transduction. And in this pathway, this kinase functions by telling the cell to divide. And the way it does that is a kinase is something that does protein phosphorylation. So what this enzyme has as its substrate, is it has specific proteins, target proteins, that it is going to, in a chemical reaction, it's going to use ATP and it's going to add a phosphate to the target protein, and that's going to turn the target protein either on or off, depending on the protein. So this is this information flow, this choice, and the switch in this case is that we're going to phosphorylate proteins, add phosphorus to target protein. This target protein is designed to be regulated by the phosphate like it's a light switch. They can switch the protein on or off like that. And there's the switch. So see, it's a great example that we can get into. The cellular response, the downstream response in the skin cell is going to be to divide, to go through this cell cycle that we're going to learn about in Chapter 12. So our example is we start out looking about cell communication, cells talking to each other. We've got a source cell, we've got a target cell, and there are many, many examples of this in our body. Okay, so in the themes for our course, we're talking about, now we're starting to talk about Chapter 11, cell communication, and Chapter 12, this cell cycle control. We're talking about them sort of at the same time. You're treating them like they're one big chapter because we're chasing after a specific example. And in the themes for our course, we're really looking at this. And eukaryotes have two types of cell division. The one is called meiosis and the other is called mitosis. And in Chapter 12, we're looking at mitosis and the control of the mitosis cell division. And so that's our example that we're looking at. Meiosis is used as cell division used in the production of sperm and egg, and that's the story in Chapter 13. And for us, it's a long chapter, but it's a minor chapter. We're going to spend a lot of energy in Chapters 11 and 12, and less energy in Chapter 13. So this is where we're at in our course. We're going to learn about that all cells come from pre-existing cells, because the cells are going to divide, either by mitosis or meiosis. And I already said in the overview that bacteria, prokaryotes divide in a different way. They have different regulation. They divide by a process called fission, which our book describes very briefly. Okay, so the cell division that we're going to talk about is an example of mitosis. This cell cycle is the mitotic cell cycle, and most of the cells in your body, except the cells that make sperm and egg, most of the cells, all the other cells, are would be going through mitosis. Here's a picture from Chapter 11, and it shows the idea of a source cell producing signaling factors and releasing them. And there are a variety of different examples. Here's one where a nerve cell is releasing a signaling factor called a neurotransmitter. We talked about that briefly in class. When a nerve cell stimulates a muscle to contract, it's through the release of a signaling factor. Here's a signaling factor releasing hormone into the blood, like that. So the book is covering all different kinds of examples, which there are thousands like that. And so we're following a common thread of wound healing and example of skin cancer as we go through this. Okay, so here's a summary figure from your book. Here's the signaling factor. What would it be in our case? In our specific example, it's Pdgf, platelet-derived growth factor. It binds to a protein receptor in the cell membrane, and this is the Pdgf receptor. The Pdgf receptor, when bound to Pdgf, activates an enzyme, activates a kinase activity, kinase enzyme. There are hundreds of different kinases in your body, and they have different targets. In this case, the kinase is going to phosphorylate certain targets, and they are going to lead to the cell division. They're going to lead to advancing through the cell cycle, and the cell cycle step mitosis, cell division. And so that's our specific example. This is the general story, and in general, this pathway inside the cell that leads to some kind of cellular response, not always cell division, could be a lot of other kinds of cellular response. This is called signal transduction. Another thing just to introduce here is that there are several molecules in the cytoplasm that are involved in this that are often called second messengers. And they're called second messengers because the signaling factor out here is often thought of as being, the first messenger, the primary messenger, and then the signal is transduced, carried into the cell by these other factors signaling cellular responses. All right, so now here are some examples of cell surface proteins that are receptors in your book. And this is a really complicated figure, but look here. Here's our figure example for Pdgf. Pdgf is a receptor kinase. It happens to be a tyrosine. That's a certain amino acid, so it phosphorylates tyrosines on target proteins like that. And so this is an example. This is a general example of many receptors that are like Pdgf. They are kinases. And these are just some other examples that we need to learn about in the textbook, but in our lectures, we're not going to talk about these examples, except briefly to say, for example, here's a receptor that when the signaling factor binds, it opens a channel, like that. So it's a different response, right? Different kind of signal response. One kind of signal response is activated an enzyme kinase. Another is open a channel. Here's another one, just another general example. There are many, many examples of each of these in our body and in all eukaryotes. This one is called a G protein coupled receptor. And in this case, the activated receptor switches on a protein that is a type of G protein, and the G protein is involved in the signal transduction that will lead to a cellular response. Here's our example here. We're going to keep focusing on this, but we need to learn about these other some too in the book. Why? How significant are they? I've read that about 40% of all medicines that we take, 40% of them, work by affecting a G protein coupled receptor pathway. So this example here, how significant are these guys? It's thought that about 40% of all medicines function by regulating a G protein coupled receptor pathway. At some level, they're affecting that pathway like that. So this is amazing, and it's a huge, huge important part of our course, this idea of cells communicating and regulating information flow, meaning regulating choices of what the cells should do. And here's just a Wikipedia page. Wikipedia is great. As far as I'm concerned, it appears to be targeted to college students and the knowledge you need to know. So if you're confused about a term like a protein kinase, well, here's a great definition. And some additional information. We have about 500 different kinases in our DNA, in our bodies. Why so many different? Because there's so many different types of information choices that cells make throughout our life, throughout our day, and throughout our life, like that. And then they regulate lots of proteins. We've studied some proteins, up to 30% of proteins in our body are regulated by this kinase. That means they're target proteins that could get regulated, switched on or off by having a phosphate added by a kinase. Okay, so I think we're going to stop there, and we'll pick it up in the next mini lecture.